Okay, colleagues, we'll start the webinar now. So first of all, may I take this opportunity to thank you all for coming along to our webinar today. We're very excited to be talking to you on this important topic. This is the second of a three-part seminar series that's organised in collaboration between the UNESCO Chair in Inclusive and Quality Education at the University of Bristol and UNESCO, the Futures of Education Initiative. We're delighted to see so many of you here. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panel, but just to put you, just to give it a little bit of perspective, it might be useful just to review what the overall purpose of the seminar series is. So, Christy, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide. So, the seminar series is really about what we understand by sustainable futures and what education can contribute to that. But of course, you know, when we're thinking about sustainable futures and the Futures of Education initiative, it's important to question, you know, what futures are we talking about? Who's defining the future? Which framing of the future tends to get privileged? And which framings of the future or understandings of the future tend to get marginalized? So the impetus behind this seminar series is really to ask those questions. What does it mean when we begin to try and decolonize education futures and the idea of sustainable futures? Last week, we had a discussion where we discussed in quite general terms what we understand by sustainable futures. And we linked it to the Futures of Education initiative. We had an introduction to the initiative. And for those who weren't able to attend last week, there is a recording of last week's session available, which you can refer to at any time. So we asked really those big questions. What do we mean by sustainable futures? What do we mean by decolonizing? We know that, you know, the way that that the whole development enterprise, if you like, has been framed since colonial times has been very much in Western Eurocentric terms. So there's a need really to move beyond that, to join up, to bring into conversation different ways of understanding the world, different ways of interpreting what sustainable futures are, and different kinds of knowledge systems as well, and languages. So we talked in broad terms about what the decolonizing agenda means in practice for the idea of sustainable futures. This week, we're going to focus in a little bit more on practice. What does it all mean in practice, and particularly for our educational organizations and institutions? What does it mean for individuals in civil society, for different stakeholders in society when we talk about decolonizing education? And in addressing these questions, I'm delighted to be able to draw on an excellent panel of people who will be helping us to address these questions. We have my co-convener for today's session, Yvette Hutchinson, is the Quality Assurance and Teacher Training Advisor for the British Council. She leads on the educational content for the International School Award. She organises international policy dialogues with education ministries and leads study visits for overseas policymakers and senior leaders. She spent the first years of her career teaching English and lecturing in initial teacher education, and then as an advisor for newly qualified teacher induction and early career leadership. She's a panel member for the Economic and Social Research Council and is deputy chair of the United Kingdom Forum for International Education and Training. So we're delighted that, to welcome you, Yvette, today. We also have on the panel Dr. Tania Saeed, who's an associate professor of sociology at Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. Tania's research focuses on issues of education, exploring questions of citizenship, identity, and social justice, both in the context of the UK and Pakistan. She's the author of Islamophobia and Securitization, Religion, Ethnicity, and Female Voice, and she, which is one of the background papers that for the Future of Education initiative, and she'll be referring to that as part of her contribution. She's an elected chair for the South Asia Special Interest Group at the Comparative International Education Society. So Tania, we're delighted to welcome you. But today's session also has a uniquely Bristol feel, and this is important. Bristol as a city has been deeply implicated in the whole colonial project, in the whole history of slavery, and our institutions are marked by that history. They've been affected by that history. So we're very pleased to have two colleagues on the panel who belong to institutions within the city. So we have Ben Vanetta, otherwise known as Vanetta Spence, who spent 16 years teaching at secondary school in Bristol, with 10 of those years spent on the senior leadership team. In September 2019, she took up a new post as principal of a large primary school in East Central Bristol. The school serves over 500 pupils aged 3 to 11, with 68% coming from Black, Asian, or minority ethnic backgrounds. Importantly, Ben is also a representative of the Global Teachers Network in Bristol, and she'll be talking a little bit about that experience in her presentation. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Professor Alvin Birdie, my colleague at the University of Bristol, who is a professor in economics in the Department of Economics and Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Education Innovation at the university. Alvin's been leading a community of praxis that's been looking at the whole question of decolonisation, what it means to put it into practice. And he'll be talking about that interesting and challenging work in his presentation. He's also the director of the Economics Network and was part of a team that developed CORE, which is a new way of teaching economics within discourses of power, inequality, and social justice. Before we get started with the panel, we're going to show you a brief video which encapsulates the history of our city of Bristol and helps to put into sharp relief issues of decolonisation as they affect our diverse communities and the importance of us as a university engaging with that. The video it features Lawrence who is an outstanding Bristol poet, and Lawrence is with us today, and we'll be asking Lawrence at the end to reflect back on what he's heard today. So we're looking forward to that as well. But without further ado, Christy, if you'd be kind enough to play the video, please.
Bristol is an incredibly diverse,
historic and divided city,
which has been culturally enriched
throughout its history.
Prospering through ingenious, horrendous and courageous acts.
Bristol's history is a riot.
illuminating with conflicting facts.
Bristol started life as a settlement
between the rivers Froome and Avon, named Brickstow.
known as a place by the bridge.
Brickstow enabled tribes to settle, connect and grow.
Creating a blueprint to follow, develop and expand.
Bristol rose up to be the first county in England.
Fight for King Queen Hutchinson.
For its own ambitions,
Bristol had no fear of heading straight into violent situations.
rebellions,
revolution,
and uprisings
are steeped in Bristol's past.
Creating a legacy as magical as
spells being cast.
People fighting for their rights against established institutions.
Who created great wealth
through questionable decisions.
Bristol led England's pursuit
for the enslavement of African people.
William de la Font is recorded as the first to profit from this evil.
Bristol merchants and institutions idolised to a godlike status, reap the rewards for enslaving Africans who remain nameless.
Establishing themselves as Bristol's ruling class.
Guaranteeing their descendants got a free pass.
Class and intellect were assumed to go together.
Bristol proved otherwise. Its underclass was clever.
a tale of two cities.
One homegrown.
One universities.
Both delivering rewards and prestige for the city.
Even if the methods used were not always pretty.
Bristol's independence is respected and world-renowned.
A city built on difference.
Where all cultures can be found.
Building futures for all on solid foundations.
Underpinning Bristol's great expectations.
When Bristol unifies, its achievements are exceptional.
This is the legacy we die for.
I work to fulfill.
Bristol's a city
at the forefront of revolution.
The question is.
The question is.
What would be your contribution?
That's wonderful, Christy. Thanks so much. So I think therein lies the challenge for us living in Bristol, but also more widely. How can we respond as institutions to diversity, but also to the legacy of the city that's so ingrained in our history? So to begin to answer some of these questions, I'm going to call on my the first panel member, Yvette, to please talk for 10 minutes at the most, please. And we in the meantime, if you have questions, please do put them in the question and answer slot, part of the Zoom call, if you can see that, the question and answer function. And we'll collate those questions and we'll ask them those questions of the panelists a bit later. But for now, over to you, please, Yvette.
Thank you, Leon, and thank you, Lawrence, and all those amazing contributors to that film. It's quite a challenging question, and I'm not sure that I can answer it here, but what I can do is share with you the beginning of a journey that the British Council has taken. As Leon said, I work for the British Council and I work in the schools team, and our work is around arts, education, and culture. And I'm wondering, can you see my slides?
Not at the moment, Yvette. We can now.
Ah, here they are. There we are. Wonderful. What I wanted to talk about was a series that we did over the summer on decolonisation. And I wanted to talk about this because it's not about, there are lots of activities going on around diversity, EDI, inclusion, and all of those very important things. But I wanted to talk about this series because it wasn't part of a corporate strategy. This was a kind of response to a variety of things that happened over last year, and it came from colleagues. So let me tell you a little bit about the British Council in the next slide. We are an international organisation for cultural relations, and we create friendly knowledge and understanding. Now, one of the ways, well, the ways in which we do this is by liaising, working with other countries, and creating opportunities and trust is really important to what we do. My party piece is to say that we are a non-governmental departmental body, which is a nice short way of saying that we are funded by government, but we are not we're not organized by them, we're not run by them, so we have some independence in that regard. And you'll see that English language, education, civil society and the arts, those are the areas where we work. So, you know, you may hear terms like soft power, cultural relations, and the British Council's role is to represent the UK, the 4 countries of the UK, in engaging with other countries. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the series started in August, and it was a group of colleagues who just thought, no, we have to do something about this. And they responded to the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, and together they just decided, well, we are going to do this together. And next slide, please. We had 26 colleagues from across the globe. And what I loved about this was that, in fact, I don't think there were many senior colleagues. So we had people from across different pay bands from a variety of countries. And what they decided to do was to put together, as you can see, watch-alongs, listen-alongs, just opportunities for people to talk about what decolonisation should mean for ourselves as practitioners, for the British Council itself, and for considering this topic, the sustainability of our work in cultural relations. What I also applauded was that it was about different skill sets. So as a result of this activity, what we saw was we had colleagues in the Americas who were sharing their activities around identity. The colleagues in Spain did an amazing series on Black History Month and wanted to share that with us. So it was a really good opportunity for us also to learn about some of the things that we do in the British Council, but are not necessarily brought together under a kind of umbrella of decolonisation, mutuality, and hearing the voice of what Gayatri Spivak calls the subaltern. Can we have the next slide, please? So I wanted to just share with you 3 of the webinar activities that we had. Just to say, I mean, there was a range. There was somebody who spoke about the economy of slavery. There was an activity about land rights where people were able to be involved in a ceremony around that. So there are lots of different things. But we started with Dr. Chazzy, who used to work for the British Council, and she sort of understands our ways. And she talked to us about the behaviour, systems and legacy of colonialism. And what I liked about what she said was that she gave us a good theoretical context. So the work of Walter Mignolo was introduced to many colleagues, but also that idea of a third space of genuine mutuality, and that we should be working towards that. And I found that a challenge, and I think it's something that we in the British Council really want to consider how we can achieve. Next slide, please. And then we also had an example of how we use the arts. And the idea was that we would look at videos that we already have as part of our assets, our cultural assets. And this artist was talking about the English language and about cultural identity and so on. And again, but what we did was we looked at it through a decolonizing lens. So what does that mean when we are promoting the English language? How does one do that in a way that respects multilingualism, that respects mother tongue, that isn't sort of doing sort of Macaulay's thing about the English language? How do we do that? So it was good to explore these ideas. And I have to say, it's not that we came up with answers. It's not that we have put together a document that says this is exactly how we're going to do it, but we've started a conversation, and I wanted to share what we are doing because we're a big organisation, and I think there's lots of organisations similar to ours who are wrestling with these issues, and this is just a way of sharing with you some of our journey. Can I have the next slide, please? And then I wanted to share with you another activity that we had, where we commissioned a report earlier in the year around some research called New Narratives. And as you can see, it was about youth perceptions in Africa and the UK. Now, this series is about sustainability, and I would argue, and I'm sure my fellow panelists would say the same thing, we don't want to sustain necessarily want to sustain what is currently happening. And we want to see sustainability as something that is, there is equity within it, there is mutual respect, and that what we are working towards sustaining is a realistic, healthy future for all of us. And this New Narratives activity, we commissioned some researchers to work with us on this about reciprocal perceptions between Africa and the UK. Now, again, even just saying Africa is, it's a huge continent, but we did do some snapshots, and what we wanted to do was to get a sense of the images, the language, the ways in which Africa is represented in the UK and perceived, and vice versa. So we asked 5 questions. What is the source and nature of the dominant narratives? We mapped out how young people engage with and share or resist those dominant narratives. We then asked how these narratives contribute to moulding perceptions. We asked how these narratives affect people's willingness to network across social, economic, and political boundaries. And that's important because if we are looking to the future, if we're looking to see how young people can engage, we wanted to know if the current narratives are going to affect the opportunities and the perceptions. And I can tell you that, of course, there were perceptions about class, about race, all of those things came up, and on both sides, very much from the UK perspective. A lot of the young people who were asked questions talked about a very rural perception of Africa, and sort of technologically naive. They talked about famine a lot. Equally, the African respondents talked about limited opportunity, a concern that they wouldn't be accepted, a fear of racism and racist violence. And then the last thing that we looked at was, given those dominant narratives, what about the less dominant narratives? What are they? How does one deal with them? And what came out of that report was really, really valuable for a variety of reasons. And when we shared it internally, what was interesting to us was it had started between Africa and the UK, and then other regions, the colleagues in South Asia were saying, well, can we have something like this? What about the Americas? And it was clear that this idea of perceptions between regions and the UK, and youth perceptions and our future, is worth exploring. And as a result of this report, we are currently starting another research activity where we're looking at the perceptions from external organisations as well as people within sub-Saharan Africa, and with some a group of people in the UK. So we're moving that on, and we're still developing that. So we are. I may keep people informed, actually, because it's quite an interesting thing that we're hoping to do, mainly around perceptions, how we can change dominant narratives and what that might mean for the future. And of course, in terms of our own work in soft power and cultural relations, that's going to be critical. And obviously, in a post-Brexit world where we are looking at a global Britain that wants to engage with newer markets, this is also quite an important development. Can we have the next slide, please? I thought that to go back to the series, what I would do was talk about what other people said. Because when these colleagues, they volunteered and put together this program, we weren't sure what was going to happen. It was, these activities were happening in a parallel way. The British Council had commissioned a report from Greenwich University around identity, around Black and minority ethnic staff and their opportunities. So this was happening. We were developing a minority ethnic working group. All of those things were happening in parallel. But this sort of from the bottom up activity was, I thought, really quite special. And some of the things that people said after the series was, well, as you can see, what does an institution like the British Council need to do to ensure that all our partnerships are co-constructed and co-designed? How do we ensure that we're not replicating colonial power structures in the way we design partnerships at a subconscious level? Now, those are really challenging questions, and I would like to say that we have answered them, but we haven't. But what I think is crucial is that we can't pretend that those questions haven't been raised, and we have to address them. We have to make sure that when we're looking at our programs, when we're looking at our staffing, when we're looking at our partnerships, we take into account these issues and recognize that these are colleagues, these are statements that are coming from our own colleagues, and they must be addressed. Can we have the next slide, please? Somebody else talked about decolonisation and soft power. What does that mean? How do we engage culturally and represent the UK through arts and culture and education and so on, if at the same time we are trying to do that in a decolonised way? What does that mean for that third space of mutuality? How do we achieve that? What do we need to learn? And what do we need to unlearn? And what practices do we need to challenge in order that we can get there? Next slide, please. One of the things that colleagues said was they were impressed by the willingness of the organisation to have the difficult conversation. And that is fine and it's important. But I think we would all agree that it has to go beyond having the difficult conversation, and actually to remind ourselves that it wasn't a sort of corporate initiative. We became more engaged with corporate sanction, if you will. But when it started, it was a group of volunteers, low pay bands, not necessarily well known, but people who wanted to start a conversation. You will note also in the top bubble that it says people want us to have a position on decolonisation. we can't keep burying it as if the issues don't exist. And I don't think that the British Council is any different from any other organisation in having to have those difficult conversations and thinking about what that means. Now, the principles of the new narratives is around mutuality. It's about respecting cultural difference. It's about the balance and the mutuality in our relationships and our partnerships. But in order for those things to happen, systemic change is required. Can we have the next slide, please? So as I've said, it's about policies, it's going to have to affect our programs, and definitely it's going to have an impact on our professional development. I would say that what the main points were from this activity was that volunteers gave up their own time to challenge the organisation and ask the organisation to join in with that challenge. I know that Tania in her presentation is going to talk about hierarchies, and I think one of the things that this activity did was to start thinking about how do we address some of the issues of hierarchies within our organisation, as well as the hierarchical relationship and the power dynamics of some of the relationships we have with our partnerships. I was particularly pleased that we learned about skills, activities, ideas from people whose voices we hadn't always heard. And I think it enabled us to think also about the ongoing challenge that we have as an organisation that promotes the English language, but has to do so in a way that isn't dominating, but recognising multilingualism, mother tongue, and respecting other ways of being and knowing. I don't think there's very much I'm going to say beyond that, other than to thank you and to hand over to Tania, who I believe is going to speak next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvette, indeed. Tania, without further ado, over to you. Can I just make sure that, just reinforce with the presenters, let's make sure we leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. Thank you. Over to you, Tania.
Thank you, Leon, and thank you, Yvette, for setting that up brilliantly for my conversation. So my entry into this conversation is from the perspective of an academic who is based in Pakistan, a sociologist of education, whose research, as Leon mentioned, focuses on questions of citizenship, identity, and belonging. And I think any conversation on decolonizing education needs to actually look at what's going on in post-colonial context, and it's just one of the perspectives that I will be presenting here. So to set the context, it's important when we're talking about decolonizing education to recognize, in the context of post-colonial countries like Pakistan, to recognize that it takes on different dimensions. A country like Pakistan is yet to confront the kind of social, cultural, political, and economic devastation and erasures that we have experienced under colonialism. As a reminder of that violence and erasure, I would like to share this quote from Macaulay's Minute on Education that sets the agenda for education in colonial India. And I quote, "We have to educate a people who cannot at present be educated by means of their mother tongue. We must teach them some foreign language." And he goes on to talk about the superiority of the English language. And then he mentions how we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, end quote. Now, this kind of colonial education existed in different forms in different post-colonial countries in the now what is problematically termed the global south, a term which in itself, mind you, is reflective of the kind of taken for granted hierarchies that inform much of the international education and development discourse. The hegemony of the language of the colonizer has resulted in a form of epistemic violence, a kind of dehumanization across generations that is yet to be confronted. Now, In the context, again, of Pakistan, and if you look at educational policies, because that's what I'm going to briefly sort of focus on, within the formal higher educational institutions, there is no such confrontation taking place, with universities increasingly moving towards market competition and internationalization in the hopes of creating world-class universities. Any discussion on the possibilities and limitations of decolonizing education needs to take into account the impact of the neoliberal market structure, which has created this drive towards competing in global rankings, thereby determining the kind of monetary investments being made in programs or academic degrees that are considered marketable. This is evident in the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan's Vision 2025, and you can see the cover of that report here, whereby the success of the higher education sector is based more on quantitative indicators, such as the number of universities, faculty, and students, and less on quality in terms of a diversity of what is being taught or learned. Instead, quality is measured by quality enhancement cells that are largely run by technocrats who have no knowledge or understanding about the requirements of different disciplines. In such a context, any focus on indigenous knowledge, on humanities, or the social sciences is only aimed towards creating, and I quote from the HEC vision, an enlightened, soft global image of our society, add value to our economy through creative and performing arts and design, tourism, and highlight our ethical and aesthetic values, end quote. While reforms in the higher education sector are targeted towards the market and this idea of internationalization, where with budget cuts, programs in the humanities in particular will suffer, the focus of these programs is also one that is informed largely by Eurocentric curriculum, with limited, if any, value given to indigenous knowledge, cultures, and heritage. If decolonizing education is largely about what Saini and Begum describe, and I quote here, as both looking inwards and outwards, accepting that there is more than one way of speaking about, thinking about, and researching the complex social and political phenomena bound up within our disciplines, then higher education in Pakistan is nowhere near that kind of reflection or negotiation. I will add that academics like myself, who have largely been trained in universities in, again, the problematically termed global north, are part of the problem. But we can also be part of the solution once we learn to reflect on our biases that have emerged as a result of our training and ensure that the next generation, our students, are given the space to explore, learn, and reconnect with their heritage without being caught in hierarchies that overvalue or undervalue different types of knowledge. If we move on to the level of the school, these hierarchies are also increasingly becoming evident in educational reforms, where we witness how the education system devalues and at times completely erases indigenous identities, languages, and a diverse heritage that is part of the Indian subcontinent. Instead, it celebrates uniformity and an imposed homogeneous identity through the education curriculum. This is evident in the latest educational reforms at the school level, the introduction of a single national curriculum, standardizing education where Urdu is supposed to be the medium of instruction, while Arabic is also being made compulsory. The importance of Urdu in the Pakistani context is in relation to its recognition as the national language in a country where nearly 70 languages are spoken, while ensuring that English as a medium of instruction is replaced so as to address class inequalities and promote national cohesion. Arabic is being introduced as a way to help students better understand their religion, Islam, which is the religion of the majority in this country, while the language is also being linked to job prospects in the Middle East. Far from decolonizing education, such an approach results in yet another form of epistemic violence within educational institutions, as the diversity of indigenous identities are once again co-opted under the hegemony of nationalism. There is tokenistic recognition of ethnic and religious identities in subjects such as social studies, you can see here, one nation, one curriculum. But far from celebrating and equally including ethnic, religious, indigenous bodies of knowledge, the need to ensure unity through uniformity continues to be pushed through the education agenda. Therefore, decolonizing education in such a context also means dealing with local structures of hierarchy in relation to what is considered legitimate knowledge. However, there is, maybe because I'm an optimist, there is hope. Any possibility of decolonizing education is taking place either beyond the formal structures of education or through networks and alliances between academics, civil society organizations, students, activists, or artists. Hope lies in these informal spaces of student reading groups, of civil society organizations that are struggling to reclaim linguistic diversity and heritage across the country, in street theater and street art, in the fusion of local and international music. The possibility of change is present in local student movements that are challenging bureaucratic structures of education, that are demanding the linguistic diversity should be accepted and celebrated. It is important to note that movements like Rhodes Must Fall started in South Africa, led by students at the University of Cape Town, which initially began with the demand for free education under the slogan "Fees Must Fall," and grew to challenge the reality of a post-apartheid South Africa. As we speak, student movements and campaigns are already underway, challenging educational hierarchies, demanding greater access for students belonging to different parts of Pakistan, demanding better quality and rights as students, and most importantly, demanding the restoration of student unions. These are important developments in dismantling structures that keep out diversity and undermine different voices and experiences, a first step towards decolonizing education. Within academia, international collaborations and alliances are also instrumental in forwarding any agenda of decolonizing education. I will briefly mention the example of our network, the Education, Justice and Memory Network, that is led by the incredible Dr. Julia Paulson, who will be speaking in detail about it next week, so please make sure to tune in. I just want to mention the work in Pakistan being led by our civil society partner, Engage Pakistan, that aims to use innovative pedagogies to learn and question our experience of colonialism and its implication for different communities in the context of post-colonial Pakistan. They are using animated videos to develop narratives that speak to a diverse audience with the aim of reflecting on questions of a violent history and memory in relation to the erasure of different identities. Therefore, ending on a positive note, it is important to recognize that despite the odds, alliances across academic spaces, civil society organizations, and students are disrupting existing hierarchies where decolonizing education, decolonizing knowledge has already started. I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tania, for that wonderful presentation. It's really appreciated, and glad it's nice that you're finishing on an optimistic note. As Gramsci used to say, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So that's a great note to finish on. Without further ado, can we move on to our next speaker, please? Be Alvin.
Thank you, Leon. I think that is me. Great, thank you very much, Tania. And I think I'm going to pick up some of the themes from what you discussed there in what I say. So let me just try and share my screen and make sure we get some of the logistics right first of all. So can I just check that that's okay? Yep. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to, so as Leon described in his introduction, my role here in the university is as Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education Innovation. So decolonization is one of those things that it's in a sense comes under my remit, and it's quite right, I think, that it should be thought of as a form of educational innovation and enhancement. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But in a sense, my role is a practical one. You know, I'm an educational leader in a university, and I want to make sure that we actually enact things which make changes and we see something at the end of the day. So just to begin with, let me just point out that I've been leading a community of practice on decolonization for a few years now, together with Leon and various other people drawn from around the university. And we've been thinking about what it means to practically decolonize a university and why we might want to do it and what it entails. And we've put together a FutureLearn course on the FutureLearn platform, obviously, which draws together some of the strands of activity that are taking place in the university. And there's more than just the decolonization of the curriculum taking place, obviously. There's all kinds of things to do with the attainment gap between different racial groups. There's the makeup of the student and the staff body and our recruitment practices. There's the naming of our estate and our logo, all kinds of activities taking place in the university. My focus is really on curriculum issues and why we want to decolonize the curriculum and what in practice that might entail and what we hope in the end that we might get out of it. So there's just a link there to the cargo film that you already saw, and the images you can see in the background are also just still taken from that work that we've been doing with cargo. And so just to pick up on something Tania mentioned just there, the work with outside organizations and communities is going to be a critical part of the decolonization project, even within universities, and thinking about the curriculum. But let me move back to the curriculum first of all, because when we say decolonizing the curriculum, people often say, well, what do you mean by decolonizing or decolonization? And I kind of first say to them that there are two words in those three that are problematic. It's not just decolonization, it's also curriculum. It's probably quite a good idea to get a sense of what it is that we're trying to decolonize here. And I might just also just say at the outset here that decolonization is one of those terms that some people have the impression that it's something that is achieved, and that at some stage we'll be able to say, well, look, our curriculum has been decolonized. And so I think the first thing that we have been, as a community of practice, been trying to establish is that this is a process that we need to be embedded within the university of reflection and thinking about what it is that we're doing in our curriculum. So let me just come back to curriculum for a moment. So very quickly, I mean, you know, when academics are asked, and these 3 points are from a paper in 2006, are asked about what a curriculum is, they come up with lots of different answers. So this is a kind of what emerged from this study in 2006, that some people think of the curriculum as a content and the material that we're actually imparting to students, the reading lists, the content. There's other people say it's something to do with the experience that students have of their learning, what takes place in the classroom, how they're involved in that, the activities they do. And then there's a broader kind of definition which some people make, which is to do with the continued interaction over time of staff and students with each other and with the content as well. And this is a kind of iterative process where at the end of the program, the people and perhaps the things that they're looking at just have been transformed in some way, and they look somewhat different to where they started from. And just to get a sense of the importance of changing curriculum, and I'm going to interpret curriculum in all these senses, but just to get a sense of the importance of why we would want universities to focus on their curricula and think about changing them. This quote from Pienaar is actually quite good, and his co-authors. Its curriculum is what the older generation chooses to tell the younger generation, and it becomes a site on which generations struggle to define themselves. I mean, I think there's something important about curriculum being how ideas of value and exclusion and priority are passed on to future generations. So the legacy we leave is partly going to happen through our curriculum. Let me then just try and come to a sort of culmination here by just talking about a few things that in the work that we're doing around the university to try and get our fellow academics to focus in on what needs to be done practically in order to think through this process of decolonization. What are the kinds of things we're getting them to focus on? So first of all, what are the ways in which we're asking them to exercise this kind of responsibility to future generations? And the first is to think explicitly about the material that they're teaching. So this is a content issue and its applicability. So here I'm thinking about, some of our medical textbooks, for example, where cases and diagnoses are drawn from certain nations and certain types of racial groups. And how applicable is that to contexts outside those origins? So to move away from this idea of this suggestion of universal applicability, which sometimes happens if you don't pay attention to the relevance, the kind of local relevance of what you're teaching. The second point here is to do with making space in our curricula for origins and provenance of ideas, where they come from. And many people here will know, for example, that the great statistical idea of correlation is actually almost a sort of a byproduct of trying to put the eugenics onto a scientific footing. And that's an interesting story in its own right, but the focus on origins of ideas is more important than that, because it teaches students that ideas come from social contexts. And if they come from social contexts, there are agendas there and there are hierarchies of power. And in those hierarchies of power, certain interests and certain people are being marginalized and occluded. And so it's our responsibility as educators to make sure that we acknowledge that first of all, and perhaps then think about ways that we might bring into our teaching some of these more plural perspectives. Research, the research doesn't follow a kind of linear path to truth. It sort of follows the exigencies of societal demands at any particular time. So, in my subject in economics, for example, we've learned a lot from indigenous populations about how to manage sustainable renewable resources, for example, like fisheries. So this is to do with, the second point is to do with what we sometimes call, kind of in a jargonistic way, decentering our narratives. And then the third thing here is to do with practice and what goes on in the classroom. So this is that other broader idea of curriculum, a student experience. But do students feel that that their experience is one of empowerment and inclusion, or can they see themselves reflected in the stuff that we're teaching them? Are they being asked to bring their points of view forward? Are they being given the opportunity to study, for example, data sets which they choose to study, to kind of apply our theories, for example, in areas that they are interested in? So are we making sure that our pedagogy is inclusive and relevant? And then the fourth thing here is to do with making space for all of this in our curriculum. Of course, if you're starting to talk about provenance, you're starting to pay attention to relevance, and you're starting to make space for bringing in student views. And I should say, actually, not just students, local communities are important here as well. And it's one of the reasons why we've been working closely with Cargo on some of the things that we want to do in the university as well. But space is important. Making space in the curriculum for some of these discussions is hard. And anyone who's involved in university life will know that many of our curricula are just chock full of content. And so one of the first challenges is to get people to think about what they're teaching and where that space can be made from. And to a certain extent, this involves thinking about things like canons. What is the place of the canons that we teach in some of our subjects? And is there a space for more marginal or authors from that have been marginalized from different parts of the world, in the global south, for example? And then finally, there's something about interdisciplinarity in universities. Universities are not, in the educational space, are not very good at interdisciplinarity, I would claim. And that's because historically they have been structured around disciplines which are quite tightly defined and seem to be becoming ever more tightly defined. And this is where I think the research side of the house is a little bit further, because research councils at least talk about interdisciplinarity. Why is this important? Well, I think a lot of the questions that we might want students to think through, for example, just this issue of reparations, what are reparations? What's the basis of them? What amounts are we talking about? This is something that crosses legal boundaries, ethics, economics, history, politics. And so it's hard to think through some of these issues because they're fundamentally interdisciplinary. And I would say the same, of course, about sustainability and our responsibility to the future generations in a broader sense as well. So let me finish there, and I'll pass back I think it's Ben who's coming after me.
Yes, indeed. Thanks so much, Alvin, for that really stimulating, thought-provoking
Sorry, I've got to
presentation.
stop sharing. Sorry, there we go. Okay.
Ben, I understand that you don't have a slideshow. You're going to speak from the heart. So over to you when you're ready.
Hi everybody. Yes, along with lots of other teachers are about at the moment, we've spent quite a lot of our last year or so presenting on PowerPoint slides. So you've just got my face because I, just wanted to talk to you about the experience of decolonising the curriculum when you come right the way down to what it looks like at primary and secondary education, and just a part of the journey that I've been on with my school and my colleagues and my teachers. So as Leon very kindly said earlier, I'm a principal of a large inner city primary school in Bristol. And I'm also a part of the Global Majority Teachers Network. I'm very lucky to have one of my mentors out there today in the webinar, Linda, who's also a part of that network. So we have been having this discussion and we've been talking about this and how we influence our curriculum for quite a while. We've been talking about how we tackle this on the ground and how we bring some of the ideas that Alvin has talked about right the way down to at the very first classrooms, the very first education system that we encounter. And as part of the Global Majority Teacher Group, we started looking at that in terms of representation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic teachers across the city. And within that, we also work with Esther Deans, who leads on the Bristol One curriculum. So we've been really talking and trying to examine this and how we go about it. So the catalyst, I think, so despite having these conversations, the biggest catalyst around primary and secondary education was Black Lives Matters. When the movement really took a hold of the country, of our collective psyche, we really saw a shift in terms of organisations and large organisations and primary and secondary organisations and trusts really wanting to have an examine and take a look at their curriculum. But this in itself poses significant issues, because what we're essentially asking at that moment is to look at anti-racist for us or anti-colonial for us ideas. How do we unpick what the schema is that we've been asked to teach, and how do we reflect diverse voices? And that is has been quite a challenge. The Bristol One curriculum is one avenue that Bristol explores that, where it has teachers contributing to schemes of work that can be shared across so that we can teach from that and so that we can start getting those voices in. We've spoken also about cargo that Alvin has mentioned, and we had the video from Lawrence earlier. So we've also talked about how we get outside organisations really helping to upskill education is inside schools and delivering what we're calling decolonisation. And I do agree with Alvin that it needs to be a reflection. You can't just suddenly wake up one day and decide that your curriculum has been decolonised. But also for me as a leader and as a new leader, I was given the opportunity to really work on this across a whole school. And that responsibility in itself as a leader is quite a large responsibility. It's large because unfortunately it rests on your shoulders, and dismantling and looking at your curriculum and leading on that comes from the head. In order to tackle this and to really move this forward, I joined a group that works across phase, secondary and primary, where we're able to share our information, because unfortunately one of the big issues or the key issues that we have when really working at decolonising education or reflecting diverse voices in what we teach is that most of the voices at school are not diverse. So these the things that we're asking people to do require a significant amount of upskilling. And I was really lucky enough to have the paper, one of the UNESCO papers that we talked about earlier, sent to me quite early on, because this is a real issue. So one of the big things is, how do you go about educating staff who might not reflect the diverse voices that are around you? And that really has to be in terms of conversation. So we went back as our cross-phase group. We looked at allyship. We looked at really talking openly and honestly about the issues that affect different communities, about how we could put those, and where we have a skills gap or a deficit, because it's a really it's a real huge issue. A lot of the things that we're encountering is either a lack of education or a fear of getting it wrong, and that is really important. The other thing that needed to be shared as a leader at this level is that this struggle is not mine alone. Okay, as a Black teacher, it was very important for me to voice this across all the groups, that this is our collective struggle, this is a collective movement, and we were going to make mistakes, and but it was about the reflection, about understanding. The clear part for our children is to see themselves reflected in what we teach. And that brings me a little bit towards the opportunities, because it's we've talked quite a lot about the barriers, the struggles, but also this gives us amazing opportunities. With the children that I have got the pleasure of teaching, having their diverse voices reflected in what they're encountering at school is not just a celebration of their voices and an acceptance that Bristol and the UK is made up of lots and lots of different voices. It's also about equity. It's about their sense of belonging. It's about their owning and understanding that they are and they do belong. And I really feel quite passionate about them really understanding that they do belong. It's about achievement, as Alvin iterated on. It's about achievement and grounding in a sense of self, and understanding that sense of self is really important, and understanding that we value their sense of self and their voice. It's about seeing themselves reflected in the content all the way up, so that they can see themselves in all walks of life when they leave. It's about the real human impact of the work that we are doing. It's also about understanding that they are ready. The children that we teach, no matter what year group, and yes, we do have to amend our curriculums to match, but the children are ready. They are absolutely ready, and they thrive, and they absolutely rise to as we change the curriculum and we introduce their voices and we introduce things where they can see themselves reflected. They absolutely thrive, and it enables them to ask questions in a safe space. It enables them to experience that sense of belonging. Now, I know that we're about to have we're very lucky have got Lawrence. So Lawrence, who our Bristol poet, as we spoke about earlier, presented to the global majority teachers a couple of weeks ago on a project that he was doing or has been doing in Cargo, which is Key Stage 3 centred. And I asked the question about whether or not we could have a look at some transcripts, and there are transcripts available on the Cargo. And one of my Year 6 teachers started to use one of Lawrence's poems called If in her teaching, and this is just in the space of a few weeks. And I'd like to read you just a little bit of the poem that a young child called Shaz completed, to show you that our children are truly ready. Okay, so a bit from the teacher first. This poem is by Shaz, who is a reluctant writer and hasn't really been keen to engage with her authors online as part of remote learning. This is the best piece of writing I have seen from her all year. I wish that people didn't get killed for the colour of their skin in the crazy judging world we live in. George Floyd died by cop. I just want this madness to stop. Muslims get treated like terrorists in their own home. Why isn't this being shown? The world should be a much kinder place where everyone is treated equally, no matter what their race. Now, for me, the power of that for me was the impact on achievement for Shaz, the fact that suddenly she felt inspired to talk about issues and things that have really affected her. Her final passage to If, the poem by Lawrence Who, is a real reflection of who she is, and it is able to activate the learning. It's the real impact of the work that we do. But not only that, it allowed Oren to respond. The children had to perform, and then children had to respond to Lawrence's poem or the poem by their peers. And Oren wrote, "I feel guilty that I didn't know. And because of my naturally white heritage, I have never experienced it." And by it, we mean racism. And I thought that when this got sent over to me by my teacher, the real feeling that I had there was that we are in education to allow our children to discuss openly, to understand, to embrace openly. You know, part of that is to give them a platform for their learning. And by decolonizing our curriculum, what we enable are their voices. What we enable are the voices of the unseen or the quiet or of the kind of generally passed over. We pull them in, we activate them, and we enable them to speak freely about their issues and what affects them. So in conclusion from me, I've still got a long way to go. I have to do work. I have to work with my staff. I have to work with my trust. I'm very lucky to be a part of a trust that has set up an equalities group that works across in response to Black Lives Matter, really examining themselves as whether or not they are an organisation that is truly tackling this issue head on. I will continue to work with my global majority teachers to feed in that information and to bring that in. But ultimately, as Alvinda said, it is about that real and continual reflection on what we consider to be the curriculum and how I can get my children and their voices heard through it. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful, Ben. Thank you so much for such a stimulating, thoughtful contribution. And as people in the audience have pointed out in the chat, it's great to also hear some children's voices. And there's a couple of questions about that I'll be asking you in a moment. But now that we've heard from our panelists, we've been collecting some questions from the audience, and I'd like to start posing those to members of the panel. First of all, Yvette, in relation to your talk, there's quite a few questions about the British Council and the British Council's role. I'll try and condense those. So forgive me if I missed some of the nuance and detail of the questions. There were a lot of questions directed at you, but just three briefly that are kind of connected. So one is, is there a tension between the British Council's promotion of English and the decolonisation agenda? I think that's something that you've already partially addressed in your talk. The second one is about also about the logo, the British Aid logo that's sometimes used, and whether that's also a sign of coloniality. But I think that's more to do with UK Aid than the British Council, quite honestly. But there is one also about priorities. So that's perhaps a better one to focus on. What are if you had to identify a key priority now, based on the work you've been doing, what would that be?
Thank you. I would say very quickly that for a long time now, the British Council has been promoting English as subject rather than English as a medium of instruction, and promoting mother tongue teaching, because students perform better when they are taught in their mother tongue, certainly in the first few years. In terms of the logo, I think, yes, there is a confusion. Our logo is the 4 dots, which represent the 4 countries of the UK. In terms of the priorities, we've got lots of paperwork and lots of plans and corporate approaches, but I think I'd like to go back to the new narratives, and they have talked about what do we amplify, what do we avoid, what do we reject, what do we contest, and what do we celebrate. And I think just making sure that the idea of this third way of mutuality starts by listening and asking our partners, what they want from us, how they want us to engage with them. And I think those would be the approaches that I think would be the most successful in making sure that we've got the equity that we would require.
Okay, thank you for that, Yvette. So there's a few interrelated questions around learner voice, and Ben, perhaps I could invite you to respond to those. So there's a question, an overarching question about when talking about people who have not been heard, do you consider young people in the conventional schooling system to be part of that group? Then there's a follow-on comment that in the Norwegian national school curriculum, they do create that kind of space. And there's also a comment that, or it's more of a comment really than a question, isn't the only way to decolonize education to value choice, freedom, and democratic governance in school?
Okay, big questions. Yes. So in terms of being unheard, I do think there is a case to say that children are unheard, and it's a very and younger children. It's a very strange space. So we do have national curriculum in the UK, and it's quite open. But because it's quite open in terms of materials and what is taught, teachers tend to teach from what is known. And if, and as I've spoken before, that there is a lack of Black, Asian and minority ethnic teachers, and if you're teaching from what you've known before, it does mean to a certain extent that the materials that you come across, the things that are used, the mediums that are taught to teach through, are predominantly white, and that is not intentional. It's really, you teach from what you know. So as I said before, the education, and also as a Black teacher, remember my education and my move through education has also been through a predominantly colonialized education. So what comes out the other end of that is that most of, or majority within my late reading, but my educational background comes from that. So you do teach from what you know. So you do have the aspect of children being unheard, or unseen, or their stories not being spoken about. So that platform is there, so they're able to articulate and talk about what their issues may be. We talked a little bit about the choice and freedom, I believe, and I think I've addressed that a little bit. Children do and can choose. They choose their outcomes, they can choose their reading books. But if you are not exposing them to the wide range, their choice is automatically limited by their environment. So I do think that it's, in order to, as I said, to activate the voices, we have to look at what we're exposing children to, especially very young children. It's slightly different at secondary when you're taught in subject specific, I can only think of this word, but subject specific silos. You know, you have RE and then you have science, and then you have the teachers within that can explore their materials more. When you get to primary school, where it's much more open, where you might be teaching a number of subjects, but your specialism is in one particular, it is a challenge to open up the curriculum. But it's not impossible. It's just another challenge and barrier to get over. So I do think there is choice and freedom, but the choice and freedom is limited by the education and schooling systems almost of the people who are delivering. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Ben. So I have a question here for. I have a question here for Tania. So how can we safely engage in decolonial efforts in contexts like Pakistan and Indian subcontinent, where religion plays such an important role? So I think that's looking at the role of religion in relation to the decolonization debate. And how can we reclaim our identities from coloniality, where far-right movements have such a strong foothold. So I think that's referring perhaps to some of the rise of ethno-nationalism in some parts of the subcontinent. There's another question that's relevant for you as well, Tania, which is about the role of research in the decolonizing venture. So I'll leave you with those two for now.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. The first question on religion and far-right movements, it's not an easy one to answer, right? You're absolutely right. I think the kind of, just when you're looking at local structures, when you're looking at local politics, when you're looking at also ideologies, nationalist ideologies, it's very, the fact that religion is something that cannot be questioned almost in our part of the world. This is happening in Pakistan right now, it's happening in India right now. Obviously it becomes a huge problem, right? So it is an obstacle to any form of decolonizing, because what happens then, and we see that also in Pakistan, the idea of decolonizing is almost pitting one identity against the other, rather than what I would say recognizing multiplicity of identities, right, and giving them equal space. So what happens, so for instance, in Pakistan, the introduction of Arabic as a compulsory language linked to, it's the language of our religion. And that's one way of sort of, reclaiming our heritage, but it's a very different heritage that you're talking about. And it's at the expense of other identities as well. So a lot of it has, the problem is also linked to the way we approach this notion of decolonizing. And the way that idea of decolonizing is also co-opted in the rhetoric that political parties and far-right parties often use, that this was the British outsiders brought it. So for instance, if you're looking at what's going on in India and the Hindutva sort of ideology being promoted through the curriculum, the idea that it was British colonizers or Mughal Muslim colonizers, and this is the authentic us. So that really complicates the whole idea of what decolonizing is and how it's being co-opted by different sort of, players. I will say this again, I think at the same time, you do see movements which are sort of challenging such, such power dynamics, right? So in India, you see students who were protesting. In Pakistan, you see students. I mean, again, it's putting a lot of burden on students who should not have to carry this entire weight of sort of taking on these power structures. But there are, you see resistance happening in pockets. And I think that is, again, the whole point of the presentation, and also the UNESCO paper was to recognize that that's where you sort of see, hope, and you see some sort of change taking place, and that they are the future. So you can push, but there is also pushback, and there's a counter narrative. Finally, because I'm also cognizant of the time, in terms of role of research, I mean, it's instrumental, right? I think in Pakistan, the biggest problem we have is that our policies are not research driven in a way. There are lots of assumptions. It's driven by certain ideologies that you are pushing. So there is definitely a role for research and a role for partnership. I will say this, and I'm cognizant of the context here. I mean, there is a problem in the way you have sort of the way research grants are structured. And that's a different question, and I won't sort of go on a tangent there. But this idea of North-South, collaborations, to what extent is there sort of, the idea of who leads the project, who is sort of complementing, supplementing, what is the nature of that partnership? I think there's so many layers to the way that works when we're talking about working, collaborating, with people in, again, the global South and the global North. I detest that word, but nonetheless, those phrases are used, and it simplifies this. But having said that, as I mentioned, there are partnerships. It depends on how you approach it. It depends on the kind of structures that exist in universities, also in, again, the so-called global North, that sort of, make sure that these hierarchies are dismantled from within. And you see that exactly happening with respect to decolonizing in education in places like Bristol, or even how it was happening in Oxford. So those connections are there, those possibilities are there, but we have to, look at it and take it with a pinch of salt, because there are a lot of dynamics that need to be unpacked. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tania. I'm sorry that we're rushing you a little bit there, but that's nonetheless a very useful, comprehensive answer. Thank you. So Alvin, a question for you. So there's a recognition that, you know, your purview and your talk is mainly focused on the curriculum, but are there wider issues in higher education linked to the decolonisation debate that universities like Bristol need to address? And the questioner has given some examples, or in fact, there's a few people that have asked related questions around student fees, the appropriateness of well-being support, the focus on sustainability and climate collapse, which is quite an interesting one. So I guess the question there is, are there connections? The demand that we test students in terms of their language as a condition for entry to university. So that those are just some examples. So I think the general question is, you know, are there issues to be addressed beyond the curriculum, and what do you see as the key priorities there for you briefly?
Yeah, maybe, thanks, great questions. And if I'll try and be brief, but I'll pick up on this sustainability thing first, because this is partly the subject of this series of seminars. Sustainability and decolonialization, I think, are kind of fundamentally linked, at least for someone like me who's an economist, because we tend to think about sustainability sometimes as an issue of kind of equality between generations. You know, so what right have we got in the current generation to be prejudicial against future generations' welfare? You know, what if we destroy the earth, then we're kind of discriminating against them. So it's an equality and discrimination issue, and across generations. And that's exactly, in fact, what colonization ends up being, is a kind of legacy that is imposed on future generations by people who didn't think carefully about what they were doing, I guess. So there is a very, very strong link with these areas. And in the end, they come down to some sense of justice and equity at their very foundation. In terms of all these other areas, you know, having said this is about equity, once you start saying equity is important and justice is important, you can't really stop anywhere. And so, you know, you can't just decolonize the curriculum and make sure that academics are kind of fully decolonized, in a sense, or, you know, your students kind of think carefully about where their knowledge comes from, for example. You have to also think about, well, you know, is our student body diverse and representative of the community? How does the university interface with the communities outside itself? Are we actually, since we benefited in some ways from the colonial project, and different universities benefited in different ways, some by direct kind of financial input, there's got to be some element of reparative as well as epistemic justice here. So, you know, how are we giving back to the communities that are around us? And partly that's done through collaborations that we've already been talking about. But all these other things, you know, well-being support, thinking, I mean, fees is a difficult one because we operate within certain constraints, but I think it is important to highlight this. And I'll just say one thing about the cost of education to finish on, which is that, because I noticed there was another question on this, the Future Learn course that we created is available on a platform that eventually requires charging, because you know, that's their model. They're a commercial organization, and our plan is to make this freely available as a set of resources. And that's not just because we believe that it's a good thing to give wider coverage to that course, but it's because there's something about decolonization which involved the sort of the sort of, in a sense, the husbandry of knowledge and you know, the use of knowledge with certain ends, and the protection of knowledge. And if we're really serious about decolonization, then I think we do need to think about how we make what we do in universities more open and representative of the communities around us.
Thanks so much, Alvin, for that. So I'd like to just finish off today by having a couple of invited comments just to round off. And I'd like to start by inviting Lawrence who is featured in the video that we showed at the beginning. As we mentioned, Lawrence is a Bristol-based poet. Lawrence, based on what you've heard, how would you like to respond to what you've been hearing so far?
Well, it's nice to hear some of what's been said, but it just feels like it's a lot too much conversation too far down the line. I just find, to be honest, I find a lot of it painful that a lot of those things being discussed, there's solutions to them, but we seem to be tiptoeing forward. And that's what, so I don't know. I find it painful. I find that a lot of this stuff came forward because of the Black Lives Matter in 2016, which started a lot of conversations to say change. It dipped. Then we've had the statue pulled down in Bristol, which said tremors around the globe. And it seems like we're starting on a journey that we should be about 40 years ahead on. So yeah, it's nice to hear that there's people talking about the change, but I just think that, even the project we did with Cargo, what we're doing, to get that moving, we had to do it independently. And a lot of people would say, this can't be done or that can't be done, or you've got to go through different processes. But just by actually attacking a problem with a solution, you actually can make a lot of difference. But I think the status quo by the institutions is kind of held to where we are. But yeah, that's just a little bit.
Great, thanks, Lawrence. That's really helpful and interesting to hear those reflections. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just to finish off, I'd like to ask Arathi, who will be facilitating the session next week, just to perhaps say a few words about what we can expect.
Yeah, thank you, Leon. Thank you, everyone who spoke, and Lawrence for those reflections. Actually, we're going to be picking up on precisely those conversations about the responsibilities and reckonings of education for sustainable futures. And I think that urgency that Lawrence reflected on there will be something that we'll be returning to next week. So I hope you can join us. We'll be talking about climate reparations with Dr. Keston Perry, as well as hearing about issues around reparative justice from Tarsila Rivera-Zay, who is in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as Bristol's very own Dr. Julia Paulson, who runs the Education, Justice and Memory Network. So I hope you can join us next week at 5 p.m. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Arathi, for that. And so just to conclude by thanking the panelists very much for your wonderful inputs, to Lawrence, not only for the video, but for your comments at the end, and to Christy, to Raphael and Arathi for helping to facilitate, and Artemio for helping to facilitate the event today. And most especially a warm thank you to all of our participants for what has been a very stimulating conversation. Thank you for your part in that, and really hope to see you next week for the final installment of our trilogy of webinars. Thank you and goodbye.